All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with David Adelsheim. We're at the Nicholson Library at Linfield University, January 22nd, 2024. And David, thank you so much for joining us today. We're talking about the 40th anniversary of the Willamette Valley AVA today. So to start with, David, tell us a little bit about the wine industry before there was the Willamette Valley AVA.
I think it's important to understand that before the Willamette Valley AVA, since 1977, we had a set of label rules in Oregon that applied obviously only to wines produced in Oregon, and they included a Willamette Valley appellation. So in fact, there was an appellation Willamette Valley already in existence when the AVA system went into effect in 1979. And because we already had this Willamette Valley, nobody said, well, we need to get an AVA immediately because we already had the appellation absolutely legal, until we read the fine print. And we realized that the federal government had tied the use of estate bottled to having a wine with an AVA on the label. So there were a number of people for whom writing estate bottled on their label was important. And what the effective date of the AVA system, which I think was 1984, but it might have been, in any case, whatever it was, they would have lost permission to use that if there wasn't an AVA. So rather quickly in 1982, the Oregon Wine Growers Association Board sort of gathered the wagons and figured out, okay, well, we're going to need to do a Willamette Valley, an Umpqua Valley, a Rogue Valley AVA, or these people won't be able to use that designation, estate bottled. So they went. I was trying to figure out why did I do this, and I realized that they came to me because I had done the label rule in '77 and figured I knew government, I could write these rules, so I was asked to write up AVA petitions for Willamette Valley, Umpqua Valley, and Rogue Valley. Well, the Rogue Valley, nobody in Rogue Valley seemed to care about estate bottling, and so although I did some initial work on that, that kind of floundered and it didn't become an AVA until I think Greg Jones did one 10 years later, roughly, maybe not quite that long. But we did all the maps and the petitions for the Willamette Valley and the Umpqua Valley and sent them in. And I don't know if one was sent in before the other, but they both were approved pretty quickly. Because in those days, AVAs were approved rather quickly. It wasn't a big, long process. Nobody was contesting them. And we saw it simply as a way to ensure that estate bottled could be used on our labels. Nobody understood that AVAs would become the de facto connection between place and wine. Because there is nothing else in the way that the U.S. government has set up labeling rules. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't think I remotely answered your question.
It's perfect. So the impetus wasn't anything, like you said, it wasn't about, we need this because of marketing, we need this.
Nobody knew what an AVA would ever mean. Mm-hmm. The AVA system came into effect because the EU basically was calling the bluff of the US government, saying, you have no system for these geographic names. Anybody can write Napa Valley on a bottle. There's no system that says it is or it isn't. So we're going to prohibit geographic names on US wine labels being imported into the EU. Unless you come up with a system. So it took them, I think, a couple of years, but they rather quickly cobbled together this AVA regulation, which for all intents and purposes today is pretty much as it was then, that required a process to designate a place with a name of historic relevance to that place, to give the arguments for why this place is different from the places outside it, and in terms of elevation or weather, soil, whatever you want to do, to draw the outline of the boundary of this AVA on the approved maps, and then to write that out in leaps and bounds so it could be published. The word wine doesn't exist in the regulation. This regulation is not about wine. It is about being able to tell people where the grapes were grown for a bottle of wine. Not anything else, how they were grown, what they were, what the crop level was, what the space, when they were picked, how good they were, nothing. Just where they were grown. And that was as much as the federal government was willing to do. They were, of course, not a Department of Agriculture. They were the Treasury Department, or a bureau within the Treasury Department. Their major concern was collecting taxes. And by extension, it had grown over time to provide truthful information about what is in this container, because wine was exempt from the Food and Drug regulations. It had its own set of regulations. That's way more detail than people would want. But that's the climate that the AVA regulation was created in, to solve a very specific problem, not to create this universe connecting place and wine.
So obviously Willamette Valley is a big place and has I don't know if people can necessarily say it starts here, ends here. So tell me about the boundary.
Where it starts and ends.
Tell me about describing the Willamette Valley.
I mean, the goal was, again, we were trying, well, first of all, I mean, Oregon in these days, and even today, I think, is a very inclusive place, very collaborative place. The goal for this AVA was to make it as big as it needed to be so that everybody that made wine in the Willamette Valley would be able to use it. It wasn't to be exclusive. It wasn't to just limit it to certain elevations or certain parts. The Willamette Valley was, in fact, the valley of the Willamette River, so the Willamette River watershed. That, in those days before the internet, you couldn't just look up what's the Willamette Valley watershed. What the ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which was still in existence for doing this back in those days, what they required was that you use these topographic maps. I think it took us 7 of them to have all the Willamette Valley. And our job was to draw a line, in essence, a big circle around what we wanted included. It wasn't a circle, but I mean, it was a line. And in our minds, the Willamette Valley started wherever the Willamette Valley starts in the Cascades and the mountains between the Willamette Valley and the Umpqua Valley, and even in the Coast Range, and it flows all the way to the Columbia, and that's all Willamette Valley. And it's the valley floor, and it's up the mountains on either side. It's to the edge of the Columbia River, and all of that is a place where you could grow grapes, and it would be in the Willamette Valley. Jumping ahead, had we known that the AVA system would become the de facto way of not just designating what the federal government said you could do, but also quality in a certain sense, we might have looked at it differently. We might have said, no, it shouldn't be everywhere where grapes could be grown. It should be only those places where grapes currently are, because you can always expand an AVA, you can never make it smaller. But that was not clear at that time because nobody had ever expanded an AVA in 1982, and they certainly hadn't made one smaller or tried to. So at that period, we just wanted to make it as big as possible. And when you start looking at the maps, these topo maps, these USGS maps that exist for, I guess, the whole United States, you realize as you go around the Willamette Valley, as you go up the hills, whether it's the Coast Range or the Cascades, at some point you run into national forests. Because the Willamette Valley was settled in the 1850s, roughly, by Europeans who pushed, of course, out the indigenous people and laid claim to land that they could farm. It was advertised, such as advertising was in the 1850s, as this Eden, this Garden of Eden where you could plant anything and it would be amazing. And so the people that came wanted to be farmers. They weren't ranchers. There are no ranches in the Willamette Valleys. They're farms. And the farming was fruit, vegetables, grains, all the things that people eat. But you could only go up so far into the mountains before you were limited by shortness of growing season or daytime temperatures or whatever. And above that, the federal government had decided to preserve forests and use the forests for production of lumber and whatever by creating national forests. So we could have actually made the Willamette Valley everything up to the national forests. And we certainly never included a national forest in the AVA because nobody would be able to plant grapes in a national forest. I'm sure there's some land in some parts as we went all the way around the Willamette Valley where we don't go right up to the national forest because there were some parts, particularly in the northeast part of the AVA, as you go from sort of the border of the Columbia River, Willamette River, and going into the Cascades, where there's quite a bit of higher elevation, over 1,000-foot elevation land that is not in national forests. But for much of the valley, the 1,000-foot elevation line actually was a very good number. It often designated where national forests started. It often showed that farming was no longer going on above that level, whether it was in national forests or had just never been developed, had never been cleared. So in essence, we started at Columbia River, followed the 1,000-foot elevation line all the way around and back to the Columbia River. There were a couple of problems. The Van Duzer Corridor. The Van Duzer Corridor never gets up to 1,000 feet. If we were following the 1,000-foot elevation line, it wouldn't run right out to the coast. So at some point we had to say, okay, this is the end of the Willamette River. We've just got to say, here's a straight line in the Van Duzer Corridor, that's the end of the Willamette Valley. And there were a couple of other places where it was just such a mess that we just drew straight lines. Because there are only a few ways you can use these maps to draw these borders. You could use the topographic line, so the 1,000-foot elevation line was great. You could draw a line from this point to this point. You could follow a road or a stream or whatever, but you couldn't make up a line. You could only make up a line if you had the beginning point and the ending point. It couldn't curve. So we were limited as to, and still today, you're limited as to how you can create this boundary. I have no idea where we are. We're remotely on topic. Oh, I know one thing.
You're doing great.
No. So we created this huge appellation. I mean, it's 130 miles from the the Columbia County boundary, which was as far north as we felt we could go on the west side of the Willamette River, where the Columbia County, Multnomah County border runs into the Willamette. That was the northernmost point, and then we followed that county line up to the 1,000-foot elevation, and that all the way around with the changes that I suggested, and back up the other side. Once we had this, I presume I submitted it to the board of directors of the Oregon Wine Growers Association, which was made up of people from all three areas of wine growing, and they must have approved it or asked for changes or whatever they did, but I sent in this typewritten petition that you can view at the TTB website today. I'm sure I threw out 4 times as many pages as I sent in to ensure that they didn't have mistakes, but it's enshrined as such as it is. But once they got it, they looked at it and were horrified that there was this huge AVA being requested. And they called me up and said, this is huge. I mean, why does it have to be so big? Couldn't you make it smaller? And I basically said, well, what part of the Willamette Valley should we leave out of the Willamette Valley? And I guess that logical argument won the day, and they approved the AVA as we had submitted it. At the time, I asked about adjacent areas, the place where King Estate is, and eventually got an extension, and the part of Southwest Washington, which has basically the same climate as the Willamette Valley, which, as far as I know, is still not an AVA. But they ignored that question. It was already big enough. They didn't want to include anything else, so they went forward with it. And it didn't take too long. I think the date of what I sent in, I think is like, well, you'd have to look it up. I think it was in the summer of 1982, and they approved it in the fall, in December of 1983. So a year and a half, basically.
So obviously you mentioned the reasoning behind this was not what it has now become, what an AVA has now become.
Yep.
Was there any short-term outcome? Did anything happen in the immediate aftermath of AVA creation?
No.
When did it start to become a big deal?
I mean, actually, your question is a huge theoretical, historic question. And it may not be the same for every AVA. I suspect Napa made more of it than we did initially, partly because it was obviously much smaller, and they had already, I mean, the Napa Valley Vintners had already started work. I think they were the second AVA that was approved. They felt it was important for them. But I don't know that, I think one of the big shifts that happened in the American wine industry, and I don't know if I can say this blanketly, but I can for the Willamette, certainly for the Willamette Valley, that in the years up to roughly 2000, we were focused on wine quality. Generally, where the grapes were grown was important, but we didn't know about those places. We didn't have the soil maps that we have today. We didn't really understand why a wine would be different in the Eola Hills from the Shalem Mountains, from the Dundee Hills. So at this point, it was particularly important for the Willamette Valley to gain a reputation for fine quality. And that's certainly what David Lett had pushed from the beginning as one of the founders of the industry, and that many of us subscribed to, that we were not going to become an important wine region unless we were known for fine wine. So that was the reason for the Steamboat Conference, for whatever work people did together or by themselves to create better and better wines, for getting people like Drouin and Bob Parker and ultimately others to come to Oregon to help raise the image for fine quality. And that really carried the day until basically the turn of the century. But by around 2000, and there's no way to pinpoint a date, the knowledgeable people in the world knew about the Willamette Valley, knew that it made fine Pinot Noir. And there wasn't a question of whether it could make good wine or what wine you should focus on. It was about Pinot, and it was about highest quality. Around that time, there were a couple of different forces at play. One was people who were trying to designate in the TTB sense, in that, well, still ATF sense, where their grapes came from, but not this thing that was 130 miles long, but something that was much smaller. The Dundee Hills were probably as pushy as any part of the North Willamette Valley for getting a designation, partly because Red Hills was, they thought, such a special designation. They were never able to get that appellation, by the way, but because there are like 5 Red Hills in the West Coast. But that was one push. And I think there was another, which was more about things that the federal government had never envisioned, qualitative things, that other people wanted to do more than just talk about where the grapes were grown. They wanted to use the AVA as a badge of quality, if you will. And I think, I hope Ken Wright would agree with me that he was certainly a proponent of using an AVA as a way to designate a place where quality wines were made. I mean, if one of the problems with the Willamette Valley AVA was that it was so large that it contained large swaths of land that maybe weren't going to make the highest quality. But if you could designate a small region and make it as small as you wanted, maybe you could limit it to just the places that could make the highest quality. So there were these two things going on that started accumulating around 2000. Fundamentally, it's a change from a focus on wine quality, which was then assumed to be the baseline. If you made crappy wine, nothing else mattered. But if you were making great wine, how do you differentiate places? And by then, what we now call nested AVA designation would be one way to separate, to first do what Alex Sokolblasser wanted, which was to designate this place so that was much smaller than the Willamette Valley, and to do what Ken Wright wanted, which was to raise the focus of quality image by having a nested AVA. And after a couple of early conversations in the mid-90s, late 90s, by I think it was 2001, or maybe late 2000s, a group of people came together that initially represented what became 5 of the 6 AVAs, and eventually a 6th person, or somebody representing the 6th area was brought in, and we worked on petitions for the 6 AVAs together. I don't know that we thought of this at the time, but this was our way of doing what the French government does, which is to designate things top down rather than this crappy AVA system that exists, where literally anybody can write a petition to the federal government. Anybody. Now, it may not get approved today because everybody is aware, and you have comment periods, and if everybody says this guy is nuts, this should never exist, they probably wouldn't get it. But back in the day, anybody who sent in a petition would get it approved because nobody cared. Nobody saw a reason for, oh, if that's what the guy wants, whatever. So the thing that we wanted to do is work together so that the boundaries would be clear and differentiated, so that the Dundee Hills and Yamhill Carlton wouldn't overlap in that part of the Dundee Hills, which actually has soils like Yamhill Carlton. And in that area, we asked the people who had vineyards, what AVA do you want to be in? You can't be in both. And they said they wanted to be in the Dundee Hills. But it was this group that met, it wasn't exactly monthly until the end when we were kind of wrapping things up. But Alex Okelblasser was the chair, and there were representatives from what became each of the 6 AVAs. And we talked through how you write a petition. I was the only one that had written a petition before. And while the document from the ATF was relatively clear, we didn't want people wasting a lot of time, but we wanted them to be doing a good job so that it would get approved. March 15th, we were meeting at our winery, and everybody had brought their final petition and all the maps.
2002?
I'm sorry, yes, 2002.
March 15th, 2002?
Yeah. Took a photo and stuck all the petitions and all the maps into one envelope and sent it off to the ATF. They'd never gotten a petition with another petition. And once it got to the ATF, they handed them out to a bunch of people, and some got approved in 2 years, some took 4 years, but it showed that the process, in fact, was much more top-down rather than a bunch of independent people trying to divine these subdivisions.
It's a very Oregon solution.
It was. I don't know that we exactly understood that, but I think we realized that meeting together was important, partly because nobody had done this before, and partly because there was the example of Sonoma, where their nested AVAs within Sonoma County are a disaster because anybody could petition them. And so there are places where you are in 4 nested AVAs because they overlap, and people put in whatever they wanted, and the TTB was in no position to say, well, this is garbage. It was all based on public comment, and if nobody came in and said this is garbage, then they ended up approving it. So we wanted to avoid that. Burgundy is in some ways the gold standard of what you would like. That the AVA system is not the AOC system or AOP system today. It's, as I've said, it's just a way to designate where grapes are grown. But we wanted to make it as helpful to consumers and as concise and as mutually exclusive, so that if you talked about Yamhill Carlton, it meant this, and if you talked about Dundee Hills, it meant this, Shayla Mountains meant this, etc. Already in this process was a preview of coming attractions, because Ribbon Ridge, which is one of the most densely planted little, I think it's 12 square miles, of land in the Willamette Valley, when I was drawing the Shayla Mountains map, the 200-foot bottom elevation line includes Ribbon Ridge. There were clearly two approaches. You could have the Shale Mountains without Ribbon Ridge or the Shale Mountains with Ribbon Ridge. And I appealed to a meeting of Ribbon Ridge growers that it made logical sense to include Ribbon Ridge, just like we're including Parrot Mountain and whatever other parts of the Shale Mountains, and they agreed, creating in essence the first instance of a nested AVA, though nobody talked in those terms in the day, and it was not meant as a subsection, but as a section within a bigger section, within a much bigger section. So we're up to date. So the question now is the process done? Probably not. Although after the initial 6 nested AVAs, 5 more have been added. As far as I know, there is no other nested AVA in process today. But certainly, just speaking from the Shale Mountains, I'm sure that there will be future nested AVAs, and I'm sure that people in Yamhill Carlton, perhaps Dundee Hills, perhaps Eola Amity, the bigger AVAs are all interested in helping consumers, because once we change the focus from making great wine to making great wine from a specific place, what that place conferred on the wine started to become important. What the Willamette Valley confers on a wine are general aspects, the climatic aspects, the cooler climate, particularly at the time of ripening, which gives wines with higher acidities, fresher fruit qualities. These are things you can say about all the Willamette Valley. As you go into these nested AVAs, there's probably only one where you can make a statement where it's actually true. That's Ribbon Ridge. Because it's so small, it doesn't have huge elevation differences, it doesn't have huge soil differences. The wines have a certain reddish black spiciness that is unique to that place. Can you say that about the bigger appellations? Dundee Hills, well, a quarter of the Dundee Hills are not on that red basaltic soil that they originally were going to name the appellation after. It's on sedimentary soil along the west side. Eola Amity, same problem. The west side, all the basalt has been worn away and it's sedimentary soil. Shale Mountains is the worst case. We have 3 different soils, the basalt and the sedimentary, and on the north side we've got the loess that was blown up on top of the basalt. So all of these larger AVAs make a range of wines when you get down to the specifics because of soil. Obviously, there are other aspects beyond soil, the mesoclimate of each vineyard, the aspect, and things like that. But soil is a major contributor, no doubt. So as people, well, back when we got the Shale Mountains approved in, I think it came back in 2006, we were so excited we had the, because by now we knew that the AVA was a big deal. We set up an organization, and we were so excited to be able to market this organization, or this AVA, and we said our grapes come from within this line that we drew, and people said, hey, well, that's great, but what are the wines supposed to taste like? Well, we have 3 different soils, and then the story falls apart. So that's really as as we try to get closer to the ideal that Burgundy ascribes to, though also doesn't quite reach, of having a way to tell consumers and media, our own winemakers, our tasting room people, what our wines taste like because of where those grapes are grown, there will be future nested, possibly nested AVAs to try to help tell that story.
So with that said, obviously the legacy of the Willamette Valley AVA is still being unfolded, still being told.
Yep.
But tell me about the first 40 years of it, and as you have seen it be, as you say, kind of taken, nested, and taken pieces of it here and there. The overall Willamette Valley AVA still roughly the same as it was 40 years ago?
Well, warmer. And I think in many ways that's both been a positive and a negative. I mean, global warming has in fact ensured that we have no crappy vintages. We don't have a 1984 again. It's helped Burgundy, it's helped Germany. I mean, all these places that focus on cool climates, their climate isn't so cool. And the means of maximizing ripeness, to some extent now present a challenge in the guise of over-ripeness. I mean, the best hill in the region around the town of Sancerre in France is now too warm for Sauvignon Blanc. And we haven't gotten to that point in the Willamette Valley. The tools we have to fight global warming on in a winemaking sense, basically picking earlier, are still working. We can make wines that are fresher, more lively than most people in the United States at this point, because of, particularly in those autumns where it's not 95 degrees in the month of September. But we have not stopped global warming. And the next 20 years of global warming will not be as good as the last 20 years in terms of helping us make better, more consistent, more lovable Pinot Noir. One of the advantages of the Willamette Valley AVA has had, I mean, we have this 130-mile long AVA, great. I mean, it's a beautiful place, etc. But what has made it famous is our focus on quality Pinot Noir. That's what has done that. And as long as we can make what is thought of as world-class Pinot Noir, the AVA has a bright future. As parts of the Willamette Valley become routinely too warm for that, that throws all predictions of the future into chaos, because Pinot Noir is who we are. Sure, we grow 0.5% of our plantings are Gamay. I'm sure somebody has planted Cabernet Franc, but we're known for one thing. So the future of what the Willamette Valley becomes, particularly if the larger countries of the world are unsuccessful at stemming continuing warming, is up in the air. You can't suddenly become one of the world-class Pinot, or go from being one of the world-class Pinot Noir producers to being a place that makes 20 different varieties, pretty good wine. Look to the state to the north of us to see how successful that's been. It's not a winning way of building a reputation. And there's no conversation about this. There's no research on this. I think much of the initial research will be how to minimize the effect of global warming, first by winemaking, then by grape growing, using clones, using rootstocks. When that fails, then using location of vineyards, going up the hill, around the hill. But at some point, if global warming continues unabated, Pinot Noir isn't a viable grape here except to make lush, unctuous, overripe garbage. That's a ways away, needless to say. Again, I answered some other question than what you asked, but
That's the whole point here. So just to kind of wrap it up then, let's talk about the 40 years you've seen with the AVA. What are the highlights that have happened in the Willamette Valley? What are the big?
oh, I mean, they're to flip your question on its head just for a second, but I will try to remember what it was. I'm often asked, well, what was the turning point? There was no turning point. There were a succession of important steps from before when the AVA was created up through, I'm sure, last year. Things that were being done better, things that were being done for the first time, recognition of places, of people, of collaborations, of events that we've done together. All these things have helped raise the bar on the seriousness of what the AVA is about. The AVA, I don't even, the first organization that was created beyond statewide, so the first organization created in this region was the Yamhill County Wine Growers Association, which I think around 2000 became the Willamette Valley Wine Growers Association, WVWA. And that has become a very, very strong organization. This is being presented to their annual meeting. And part of that is because the AVA is strong and the story is concise and relatively easy to tell. We've also been lucky with some of the strong people who have led the organization, both on the staff side and on the board side. So to your original question, what had been some of the stepping stones of import? I mean, it's everything from IRI winning medals or recognition for their South Block 75 wine in a tasting in Burgundy in 79, and a tasting in Paris in 79, and one in Burgundy in 1980, through the Drouins buying property in 87, to Beaufrere and Argyle that represented foreign investment as well, to doing IPNC and taking the governor to Burgundy and doing a tasting of Oregon wines in Burgundy. Being able to attract a succession of people who have gone on to make highly recognized wines, which gives them recognition as individuals, but then reflects back on the Willamette Valley as well. The Willamette Valley is clearly a region of great seriousness that is hugely attractive to talented people wanting to make a place for themselves. And when they get here, they end up getting sucked into this ethos of rising tide, floating all boats.
All right. So obviously you know the purpose of this. Is there anything else that you think that the people should know for this kind of conversation?
Well, we need to say happy birthday, happy 40th anniversary, Willamette Valley AVA. May you prosper. May you not get too hot. May you retain Oregonianness.
I like that. I'm gonna keep that one for my own mind. All right. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your time as always.
Thank you for being willing to take this on, Rich.
Of course, absolutely. Let you off the hook. Thank you.